Okay, I'm Michael Church, Director of the State Archives here at the Kansas Historical Society. Thank you for coming to this special talk on biofeedback. And Dr. Andrew Ventimigilia is Assistant Professor of Mass Media, a Media and Cultural Studies Scholar in the College of Arts and Sciences at Illinois State University. And he'll be giving a talk entitled Inventing Biofeedback, the Elmer and Alyce Green Archives and the History of Biofeedback. Dr. Ventimilia's first book is Copywriting God, which was published by the Cambridge University Press in 2019. And this talk is supported also by the Elmer E. and Alyce M. Green Foundation, which since 2016 has worked to preserve, protect, and make available Elmer's collected works in applied spirituality, transpersonal teaching, and scientific exploration. So,
great.
Come on up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. So, yes, thank you to Peter and Sarah and the Elmer and Alyce Green Foundation, Kansas Historical Society. Yeah, this is very raw research, so by no means is this a formal presentation. And it would probably be better suited because many of you in the audience are experts as well, or even more so than I am. So I'm interested to hear from you. So more of a conference room setting might be even more appropriate than a formal lecture, which is just one way of saying feel free to interrupt me with your own expertise as necessary. And what I'll do, I'm just going to kind of walk you through how this project developed and where we are with it. This book titled Inventing Feedback. What are some of the motivating questions and kind of theoretical and historical questions we're looking to answer, and what we hope to contribute with this book, focusing on the history of biofeedback. And then I also will give a kind of survey of the materials that I've looked at so far, focusing primarily on the house, Elmer and Alyce Green's house in Ozaki, which has an incredible amount of materials. And then secondarily, but really not secondarily in importance, the materials from the Menninger Foundations here, which I've been working through as well since Elmer was worked here for a number of years. So okay, so that's the kind of broad. The kind of broad picture that we're looking at. So my own work, I'm interested in, my own trajectory is a little bit unusual. So I'm a cultural studies, media studies professor, and most of my early work was in religion and media with a focus on the legal aspects of media. So as Michael mentioned, my first book was called Copywriting God, Ownership of the Sacred in American Religion. And in that book, I looked at how American religious organizations could use the law to organize materials, and in the process of doing so, shape followers and have a kind of impact on, create authority and organize and contribute to their organization. So I looked at copyright and the use of copyright to control sacred and prophetic texts. Then I looked at trademark law, so religious organizations' use of trademark law and disputes around church names. So there are some cases around that, with a focus on Church of Christ, the Christian Science Church, the Church of Christ Scientist, who had a very interesting trademark strategy to kind of organize their church. And so there's one category left in intellectual property, which I didn't focus on, which is patents. And I was interested in kind of completing my trinity of intellectual property work in relationship to religion. Although there isn't a lot of work in, there isn't a lot of religious patenting going on. There's some incidental patents related to religion, things like Bible software applications, patented meditation materials, things like that. And I have done some work in Bible software, but there wasn't enough really to warrant in-depth exploration. Let me see if I can get, let's see. I can do old-fashioned paper notes. So I slightly reoriented myself away from patents necessarily, although patents do feature in the story of biofeedback, to a broader question about the relationship between religion, or really kind of religious and spiritual practices broadly conceived, and technological innovation. So I was interested in asking the question, what's the relationship between spiritual exploration and technological innovation, and thinking about the interplay between spiritual practices and innovation, and whether or not that could be identified at the level of both patent documents. These are patents from Monroe Technologies, Robert Monroe's HemiSync technology patent, at the level of patents and technical instrumentation, as well as kind of human practices, right? So I started looking at materials related to parapsychology at UC Santa Barbara, and this was with a grant called Communicating Innovation Across Boundaries. So I was interested in thinking, like, how do people have spiritual or countercultural, interesting practices, exploring a sense of self, and then translating that, turning it into kind of technological, both technological instrumentation and also scientific practice. So the parapsychology materials were very interesting. UC Santa Barbara also has an American religions collection. And in that context, I came across biofeedback, the California branch of biofeedback with Barbara Brown and others. It seemed to me that biofeedback was a really interesting set of practices that operated as a site for spiritual innovation and technological experimentation, right? Both things were happening at once, and you had different materials in the Santa Barbara archives that would differently emphasize, are these technical practices, therapeutic practices, scientific practices, or things that looked more like religious documents, right? Or countercultural spiritual documents, like this biofeedback primer, right? From 1976, which the quote here, right? It's not just about, it's primarily about self-improvement and using instrumentation to improve the self, but the language used as well, altering states of consciousness, borrows from other religious traditions and experimental traditions. Let's see. So in that context, I was interested I started looking at this material, but didn't entirely know what to do with it. So I spoke to one of my former PhD advisors, Ari Kelman, who's currently at Stanford. And he was also interested in feedback from an educational perspective. So how do people use feedback to improve in an educational context? What do feedback loops look like between humans? And so and he had some contacts at MIT Press. So we actually pitched a book for a series called Essential Knowledges that was going to be a kind of theoretical history of feedback as a concept. However, in the process of writing the book proposal, I was really excited about some of these concrete historical practices, the biofeedback practices. So I pulled a lot of that stuff in, including popular trade press coverage of the biofeedback movement, which has some incredible kind of photographs and illustrations of biofeedback. And I think they clearly saw this was where our interest lay, was in this historical moment, the development of biofeedback practices. So they declined our proposal, but asked us to resubmit a book proposal as a standalone project rather than part of this pre-existing series. So we did that, and we said we would write a history of the biofeedback movement, biofeedback and neurofeedback, starting from cybernetics to the kind of contemporary moment. And that book proposal was accepted. So we have a delivery date for the manuscript of August 2027. So we are currently collecting information. Ari on the West Coast is, I believe, conducting oral interviews, oral histories with people in the biofeedback movement, and we're continuing to collect archival materials as well. So what does the book hope to do? We hope to provide a history of biofeedback devices starting from the cybernetic era of the 1950s through to contemporary wearables, entrainment devices, and even potentially discussion of AI. We define feedback devices quite broadly as those devices used to monitor and collect a wide range of neurological and biological data with the purpose of using that data as input to improve individual performance. Beyond this kind of foundational history, which I think is of interest to anyone practicing biofeedback and folks interested in the history of technology, We're also interested in the humanistic, spiritual, religious side of biofeedback, which we conceptualized. We're currently calling it the systematized self. I originally called it the generative self, which I think is a better term, but anyway. So we're interested in looking at a history and genealogy of feedback devices and their invention in order to demonstrate that the centrality of feedback as a concept reconfigured the self as fundamentally constituted by feedback loops, what we call something. Systematized self, generative self, something along those lines. And one of the things we're interested in exploring here through the materials is that this idea of self is not just a humanistic concept, right? And it's not just a kind of philosophy of self. It is one that's also construed, in other words, constructed in experiments, patent drawings, technological specifications, in the material devices themselves. So you can trace a history of self through this kind of material history of technology. And in the process, this self, what are the characteristics of it? It's one that is subject, as a unique subject, simultaneously self-possessed. So biofeedback offers the promise of self-improvement, right? That you can use these tools to identify elements of your thinking, of your bodily processes, non-conscious bodily processes, and you can gain control over those processes, right? You can gain voluntary control over those processes, and as such be increasingly self-possessed, increasingly capable of asserting yourself, of gaining increased self-awareness, of limiting psychological issues, et cetera. At the same time, and one of the tensions is that once concepts of self are understood to be visualizable within technologies, they can also be, there's this threat that the self is now visible to others, and as such subject to external forces or subject to manipulation by others. So that may not be a legitimate fear within the biofeedback movement, but it is a tension that I think the Greens and many others struggled with, is how do we use this tool, how do we offer these tools as ways to improve the self, and yet at the same time, they are increasingly tools that monitor and surveil the self in ways that people might see as giving up certain elements of control. And I think maybe that'll come, that idea will come through a little bit more clearly when I kind of show some of the historical materials. Additionally, why is the history of biofeedback devices important today? So this is kind of, the pitch. What is the contemporary relevance here? I think there's tons of contemporary relevance, right? First of all, it directly feeds into the history of wearable technologies, right? So we can better understand how wearable technologies developed and how they influence our sense of self. This is not just the most familiar wearable technologies like Fitbits, smartwatches, et cetera, but also more experimental devices like brain implants. This is a picture of BrainLink Pro, which collects neurological data for self-improvement purposes. A lot of these things that kind of straddle the line of experimental, scientific, and kind of marginal, questionable tools, right? Okay, in addition, we can identify how biofeedback has been incorporated into other industries, like marketing analytics, for tracking users and measuring influence. So many of the same tools used in biofeedback, like monitoring heart rate, brainwave data, has also increasingly been used in marketing analytics for tracking users and measuring influence. In fact, Nielsen, which is one of the most famous marketing analytic companies, media analytic companies that collects data to monitor radio and television use, so it has history all the way back to the 40s, is one of the largest owners of neuroscientific patents. It bought a lot of, it's bought companies and now has a very extensive patent portfolio, with the assumption that the devices used to collect brainwave data will be very useful for monitoring the effectiveness of brands, marketing campaigns, et cetera, in the future. Yeah. These are some of the Nielsen inventions that externalize neurological and biological data. but instead of being oriented towards self-improvement, are rather creating an improved consumer, one who's subject to influence and persuasion by the advertiser. So that's just giving you some framing. That's a little less relevant for the Greens, but important for our book. Okay. Well, we'll talk. That was one of Elmer's big concerns. The commercialization and the use by others. Yeah. Great, good. So our instincts are in the right place. And then last, and this is very speculative, but we can explore how feedback logics feature in thinking about generative AI and the human in the loop. I don't know if this will pay off. I don't know if there are any actual tangible historical connections to be made there, but there may be. We'll see. But there's lots of conversations about humans, AI, and they're modeled around feedback systems. So we'll see where that goes. Okay. The map of the book at the moment, we did have chapters for our book length project that were mapped out. But these aren't exactly the chapters, but it's kind of the key figures and themes, as I say here. So definitely some focus on the emergence of the concept of feedback in cybernetics. So Norbert Wiener and the foundational figures in cybernetics were interested in feedback, particularly homeostatic feedback, right? So that you need to have information, external information fed back into a system to maintain that system. So the idea of the thermostat is kind of central to a lot of cybernetic thinking, that in order to understand the self and in order to understand nature, you had to think of it in this kind of systematic way as construed by feedback loops. They also experimented and built inventions. And so we've been looking at some of the technologies that were developed in the cybernetic context, and some patented stuff, a couple folks patented inventions. So that's kind of the foundation. And then the bulk of the book will be occupied with the moment from I'd say, late 50s to the 80s into the 90s of the kind of heyday of the biofeedback movement, with key figures here being Joseph Kamiya, Barbara Brown, and Elmer and Alyce Green. So Ari has been speaking to Kamiya's son, I believe, collecting materials there. Barbara Brown is, of course, also present here in the history, and Elmer and Alyce Green, which we're focusing on here. Other kind of thematic things that we're looking at is, as these tools and technologies and practices developed in the biofeedback movement, where do they go from there, right? So we're interested in looking at how these technologies moved into other spaces. So therapeutic, medical spaces, and how did that happen? What technologies were adopted in those spaces? What practices were? And then how were certain feedback devices and practices commercialized? So those are kind of the key dynamics that we're looking at, is how this very rich moment in kind of both scientific and broader experimental practice that constitutes the biofeedback community get kind of siphoned off into other areas, both in productive ways and maybe less productive ways. And then also, leading into a kind of contemporary moment that we call the mindfulness industry, things like meditation apps, wearables, that are designed to improve self-awareness, amongst other things. Okay, so that gets us to the materials that I've been looking at here in Kansas, which involves Elmer and Alyce Green. So Elmer and Alyce, I don't think I have to tell many of you, were key figures in the biofeedback movement. Their practices, I think, are uniquely interesting because of the ways that they, both in their work here at Menninger and also more broadly, were able to stitch together concepts, were able to pull together concepts from kind of countercultural experimentation, transpersonal psychology, and technological invention, and bring all of that together, not only in terms of the studies they did here in Menninger, but also in their broader work that expanded beyond Menninger, and was foundational to building a kind of network of biofeedback practitioners. So the Greens conducted many studies focused on the relationship between the physiological and neurological signals and their externalization on technological instruments, and the ability for the individuals to, by seeing those signals, control those variables in what they called autogenic feedback training. And I'm not going to spend much time explaining that, in part because I figured that those of you in the audience know more about it than I do. So I'll be looking at the kind of other elements surrounding these key insights, but that's not to diminish the importance of the foundational insights they made. So I'll just mention, the Green studies range from laboratory studies using brainwave feedback trainers to help subjects recognize brain states, to experiments with Swami Rama, an Indian yogi who could demonstrate a level of control over various traditionally involuntary bodily processes like heart rate, body temperature, and brain state, and even to expansive endeavors more recently, like the Copper Wall Project, which involved the study of how a magnetized environment might affect subjects and enhance transpersonal states of consciousness. Those are my very crude reductions of the wide range of studies that they conducted. In order to better tell the history of the Green's work as it relates to the development of biofeedback research and instrumentation, I've been looking at both the Menninger papers here and the Green's extensive materials at the Research Library and Study Center in Ozaki. To say the least, the materials are extensive. These are just a couple photos that I took just of one room in the basement, which is where I spent most of my time. But there is materials across the whole house, including grant proposals, progress reports, personal correspondence, funding requests, technical specifications, and other materials that gave me a very comprehensive sense of how the Greens conducted research, and more importantly, what values and questions motivated their study. Green was a relentless collector of correspondence and materials, paper materials. As such, he saved everything and often made multiple copies of important documents, which was a challenge working through it because I couldn't even remember what I had seen before or not. And there are lots of materials here at Menninger also replicated in the house, but there's lots of unique materials in both spaces as well. So in a few days, I spent roughly 10 hours a day going through as many filing cabinets and bins as I could find, photographing them for more careful read later. So I have a set now. It was about 3,600 photos. After today, it's probably crossed the 4,000 mark. And I've cataloged them according to date and reference and author and receiver. So at least I can very quickly kind of sort through based on really basic meta information. And then I'll have to do a much more extensive analysis of the content of these, the materials I've collected over time. But what have I found so far, kind of tentatively, that will help inform our biofeedback history? It can cluster them in a few different categories, some of which, again, overlap with Menninger, some of which are unique. First, what is definitely not in the Menninger materials are early materials related to the Greens' life together. Elmer Green was 47 when he moved to Topeka to begin work at the research department of the Menninger Foundation, which means he had, a full career and set of life experiences before beginning his work here. I don't have much to say about this material yet, other than noting its existence and the kind of depth of material here. So it includes, I've just kind of broken down, just to give you a sense of the scope, materials when he worked at the Naval Ordnance Test Station, which is where he did some work. At that time, he conducted scientific experiments, filed a patent in 1956 on a air surveillance system, a surveillance camera that could be used from the air. That is actually not available because the government, under the Invention Secrecy Act, claimed that it shouldn't be publicly disclosed, which is not too unusual. Lots of patents get, if the US government finds value in them and wants to keep it, they're allowed, they can do so. So anyway, so there was patent material there, but confidential. Also a lot about his personal life, including his travels with Alyce, like his sailing trip around the world, as well as his time at University of Chicago, including his PhD dissertation there. Occasionally there will be something in the, I tried to pick representative documents to show here. Of course, they're too small to really see any of the text, but if there's anything relevant, I'll try to point it out to you. But in the interest of time, we'll just kind of move through broadly. Okay, ephemera, right? Material history. It's very important to move away from documentation, at least at times. So ephemera is just broad category identifying that. So this includes things like invention prototypes, like the miniature copper wall project on the left. Biofeedback instruments like the one in the middle, which is also here on the table, right? And also lots of other materials that were given to Green because he was an important person in this movement. A lot of other experimenters, but also commercial companies wanted to get their materials in front of Green in case he was interested and could promote it, or just to build networks. So you have a lot of materials like this quantum disk on the right, and other materials like that, which offer different kind of positive effects. This one including pain relief, improved sensory response, and reduces and eliminates laundry detergent. So, that one may be not so scientifically valid, but the point is these materials help us understand the range of instrumentation used in biofeedback practices and the experimentation in building different tools, which thus help us build a material history of the environment. I just want to note, these are materials from the Santa Barbara archives. This is also important because the biofeedback, this era from the 60s to the 80s is really characterized by a proliferation of devices designed to facilitate efforts at gaining self-awareness and improving the self through technology, which goes from kind of transpersonal psych all the way to ESP and really kind of experimental stuff. So you have a lot of companies that many of which don't last a very long time, but companies that are compiling and distributing these materials. And so the Santa Barbara archives had a ton of stuff. So this just gives you a sense of the environment in which Green and the Meningers and other scientists were operating. We had a lot of other commercial practices that were trying to harness the popularity of either biofeedback or ESP investigations and trying to commercialize it. The person who collected all the materials at UC Santa Barbara himself created a device called this acupuncture device, which is to do acupressure, identify pressure points. So this just gives you a sense of the different technology companies and distributors trying to capitalize on these trends and market different devices. Here again, similar idea. Companies, inventors created a whole range of different materials, some of which also show up in the Menninger files because Green and others at Menninger were quite concerned with companies developing technologies and referencing Menninger in their advertising materials. So if there's a biofeedback company, another one called Cyborg that I was just looking at today, that would develop a tool, some kind of tool that operates somewhere in the space of biofeedback, markets it, Menninger sees this and tells them to cease and desist, either because they have a patent on the technology or because of kind of misrepresentation of the research. Anyway, that'll come up again later. In addition, Elmer saved any and all coverage of both his experiments as well as those of other biofeedback pioneers. So news coverage that included popular press materials, and there are also lots of letters about Green featuring on Barbara Walters or speaking to newspapers to publicize his work. So there's correspondence that correlates to the news coverage as well. Coverage in the trade press, right? So as the biofeedback societies developed, they all had their own newsletters. And so there was a lot of coverage of Menninger studies and Green's work, as well as symposia and presentations that he put on, covered in the trade press. And then last, as I already mentioned, appearances in news and TV. That letter on the right, I believe, is for an appearance on Ripley's Believe It or Not, which is just one of many other instances. There are also materials related to intentional coverage, like Ida Hartley Film Foundation's work creating a documentary of the Greens' trip to India called Biofeedback, the Yoga of the West, which a cassette is over there. So news coverage and efforts to popularize and gain attention, media attention to biofeedback practices. Okay, the bulk, of course, comes in these next two categories. So bulk of the materials, both in the Green Library and in Menninger, are the studies and reports themselves, both in draft and final published form. Elmer had multiple prints of articles on hand so that he could distribute them widely. And these studies ranged from, pretty rigorous scientific studies to articles reflecting on the connection between biofeedback and other spiritual practices. For instance, it's linked to creativity, right? Mind-body creativity was an important element. All these things. Yeah, published studies, proposals, and early drafts, and then also reports on those studies for the agencies and foundations that funded them. A pretty rich repository of materials to get a sense of how these research practices were developed and then proliferated and finally publicized. Relatedly, funding requests. Menninger supported the Greens' work, but of course, any laboratory needs external funding. And so the Greens, so there are kind of formal requests from federal agencies, but then there is a lot of other grant applications related to other funding sources. I mean, there are too many, Millicent Foundation, Fetzer, lots of different organizations that would fund these projects for a year or two or longer. And this is useful for us because it allows us to trace how the Greens' efforts to secure funding were differently framed in order to make them interesting for different funders' needs and expectations. So we will look a little bit, I mean, I hope to look a little bit at the kind of potentially different rhetorical framing based on how the Greens positioned themselves in a fight for funding. Yeah, the proposals also include, of course, correspondence about the funding, budgets, and instrumentation as well, which is valuable. Okay, then last category, and I'll wrap up pretty soon. Personal correspondence, which is so expansive, it's impossible to kind of easily cluster the materials, but I've identified kind of 4 themes that I think are going to be really important to try to make sense of the biofeedback movement and Green's place in it. Okay, so first is building experimental networks. One of the critical things that the Greens did was to build a network of like-minded practitioners who could share their research and support one another. This was originally accomplished semi-informally, before then becoming formalized through organizations like the Biofeedback Research Society. And the most notable effort of this was from Green's efforts to organize the Council Grove Conference, a regular set of events that were held yearly, which allowed people from all over the nation and internationally to get together and to discuss their research. As noted in the conference plan, the idea was to bring coherence and synthesis to the current and future exploration and experimentation in altered and expanded states of consciousness. So they were even more expansive, right, than biofeedback. They were interested in exploring and investigating a whole range of interrelated topics. And in the process, this Green's efforts didn't just network individuals, they also engaged with different centers that were doing similar work, like the Stanford Research Institute, Institute of Noetic Sciences in California, and organizations like that. So here's a letter from the Stanford Research Institute discussing and mentioning Joe Camilla, for instance. In this way, research and techniques could be shared, even if there were difficulties in publishing in more traditional scientific and medical journals. Another common category in correspondence, which I've already kind of mentioned, is the necessity to shape public perception, or the concerns with public perception that misrepresented or distorted in the eyes of the Greens what biofeedback and what their research was about. So this is really important because Green's work and a lot of the work going on here did interface with experimental and border scientific practices like investigations into extrasensory perception. And Menninger, I think, the Menninger Foundation in particular, it wasn't foreign to that type of work. I mean, Gardner Murphy did a lot of work with parapsychology, but I think, especially as things developed, Menninger was concerned with, or there are instances where institutions, funders, and folks at the Menninger Foundation were concerned about references to their work that were not factual or that were misleading or that connected their work in biofeedback, which could have clear therapeutic and clinical applications like improving hypertension or migraines, with work that was not scientifically, as easy to scientifically validate as investigations into remote viewing or extrasensory perception, telepathy, et cetera. So these materials I find really interesting because they involve very careful border drawing, boundary drawing, in ways that I think, we've talked about. Green didn't want to shut down. He wanted to share his research and his approach. At the same time, there is inevitably an awareness that promiscuity of research and the way that it expands beyond scientific domains also opens it up to these kind of risks as it interfaces with other practitioners, experimentalists, and folks that were also very much in the public eye, like Uri Geller or Jack Schwartz, who folks that really love to be in the public. And so there's this concern with the public perception of both the Green's work and the work of the Menninger Foundation that is threaded throughout all of this material. Similarly, allaying public concerns, I've distinguished this because this is not necessarily about undue public attention. This was about the public being really concerned that work related to mental control and training was a form of hypnosis that was a risk to patients who would adopt and practice it. So the main issue here, and there's a lot of correspondence at the house. In fact, there's a folder labeled mind control dangers. And the problem was you had different organizations, like on this far right, Silva Mind Control, that promised similar types of practices. So efforts to control the mind for improvement, but were pretty loose in their description of what types of processes you can control and what your power would be. So if you could increase ESP, basically there are these real concerns that mind control training would open up people to external influence, and as such could lead to psychosis, demonic possession. So you have Reverend in the middle being very concerned about this, and all these other kind of issues that individuals would be very susceptible to the promises being offered by these practices. And so Green has a lot of correspondence talking about how to distinguish the work that he's doing from these other kind of problematic groups. And these groups are trying to recruit Green as well. The Silva representatives from Silva are always inviting him to stuff and asking him. So like, so Green has to kind of actively push back against this. So Green has correspondence with Silva Mind Control saying, I do not feel that the commercial and circus climate that surrounds many of the mind training courses is conducive to responsible handling of medical problems. So again, you have boundary drawing. The Monroe Institute is also a part of this. Robert Monroe, also someone working in this space that I don't know too much about yet, but his work seems to be rooted in the development of subliminal messaging tapes, which Green had a real concern about. So I just kind of want to flag that there. Monroe might be important to our story. So if any of you have more insights into Robert Monroe, that'd be great. That's more on Monroe, but and then last, exploring commercial opportunities. And again, this I think is really important. While Green was not particularly active in this space himself, other entrepreneurs saw an opportunity to profit, as evidenced by the proliferation of commercial technologies related to biofeedback and the success of other organizations like the Monroe Institute, who developed patented technologies or offered business seminars, et cetera, directly to consumers. So there are efforts by Green. So first of all, the Greens did patent, or Green with others did patent a alpha theta brainwave trainer that the Meningers said, I was just looking at the materials today, was their first patent. And they did license it to external companies, which then did not pay the royalties and then went under. So those were materials I was just looking at today. So there is some there's some little efforts to commercialize. In the 80s and 90s, there was a more concerted effort by Julian Gresser of Discovery Engineering International to patent and commercialize brain training technologies. And he tried to recruit Dale Walters, Elmer Green, and others, and they were business partners in this venture. And so that's also something I'm really interested in exploring, because this may be an important step in the kind of contemporary commercialized environment with wearables. So just kind of flagging that as well. Okay, one thing that I haven't really looked at, but that's in here as well, is experimental data and its interpretation. Lots of data, right? Core data, both qualitative, like interviews with healers during the Copper Wall project, and quantitative, like EEG readouts saved by Green. So I am also interested in this from a kind of science and technology studies perspective. Data never speaks for itself, right? It's always subject to interpretation and framing. So the fact that the bodily signals were externalized, mediated, and then subject to interpretation, and how it was interpreted, I think, will probably be something we need to kind of grapple with at some point, but I haven't even touched it yet, just because there's a lot there. So what are the takeaways here? Kind of the takeaways that I've kind of pulled so far, really like top level. But as you can see, I think there's a lot more space for complexity and different directions to go in. But just a few things that I can point out here in closing. First of all, again, from a science and technology studies perspective, science always works within a network of practitioners, and they make it. They are the ones that collect the data and make it legible to others, right? Science has grounded in kind of it's the community that builds those the relationships that circulate the data and make it visible and understandable to others. So the Greens, I think, are central in this respect, right? They developed biofeedback research, not just through the studies themselves, but the creation of networks linking a diverse range of scientists, visionaries, practitioners, and entrepreneurs. And again, I'm very interested in the fact that these boundaries, that Green's relationships were not cabined to a specific set of scientists, that he was interested in speaking to as wide a range of community as possible. Because again, I think that is the kind of spiritual innovation element that informed technological progress in this space. In doing so, the Greens built a coherent research field, yet one whose popularity beyond the scientific world also exposed it to criticism and mischaracterization, right? So that's the tension. The fact that the scientific world was not limited to, university community. The fact that it got a lot of public attention was both invigorating, but also risky, because it, challenged the legibility and prestige of the work itself. Third, the mischaracterization largely revolved around what biofeedback could tell us about our capacity for self-improvement, with those worried about the negative effects of technological surveillance and intervention into the human mind. So that's one element, right? The allaying public concerns part, that these technologies were risky in some way. And then last, Oh, I wanted to include the commercial part as well. But the Greens also then engaged in efforts to define the field by drawing boundaries between practices, both in the press and behind the scenes. So I should add something there as well about the commercial environment that they're working in, because that's going to be central. Yeah, so these are some of the things that I think we can already learn from the materials that I've collected. And hopefully it's a story that I can keep enriching as I work with it. So with that, thank you very much. Here's my contact info. I'd be happy to hear from any of you, and my first book for promotional purposes. So yeah, thank you very much.
You have time for any questions?
Yeah, sure. Or comments, or just any thoughts about where, you know, where I might look for more material, or who to talk to, or.
Oh, could you go back?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say something you had mentioned before. I have always thought, in all the work that I did in biofeedback, that there is a spiritual aspect to that thing. And it didn't matter whether you were a non-believer or a Christian, or, you know, whatever your background and belief was, is that once we do that brainwave training and get into that alpha theta, that reverie state, as we call it, there's a connection to something else.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the kind of the spiritual innovation element that I want to track, especially because myself and Ari also, we do work on religion and religious practice. So it's not something, but then there's a care with which the Greens and others use their language to explain those elements of the study, right? So reverie is like an important, you know, like investigating creativity, right? Can be analogous in some instances with spiritual questions, but also I think is more legible to the Menninger, you know, like more legible in clinical scientific spaces.
That's where we get answers from the unconscious. And so we had developed a method of processing those images that people had, but that you determine what it is. Not up to you to determine what you're telling yourself. Yeah. Which we've talked about. That's another one of the, I haven't really highlighted that here, but that's one of the tensions as well, is given Green's interest in empowering the subjects of the studies, that may pose some difficulties in terms of how it was read in the medical establishment. So one of the things we might look at is, so I know, does the name Margaret Ayers ring a bell? So she patented materials, and then in my mind has a program by which people analyze. So I'm wondering if there are some practitioners like Margaret Ayers who more adopted the traditional mode of, here's how we apply biofeedback, and here are the practitioners who can study and interpret, which is slightly different from Green's perspective, empowering the people who are. Anyway, I'm trying to think about how to navigate that and how that played out historically.
So there were these different groups within the Biofeedback Research Society, which became the Biofeedback Society of America, now AAPB, that were very much, you know, driven by stimulus response psychology, demanding that you speak in the language of conditions, typical offer conditioning. And that was very troublesome for Elmer, because he was saying this isn't about stimulus response conditioning, it's about learning. And what is human learning? When does human learning occur, and how can we optimize? And so you were talking about the surveillance, you know, this idea of here's someone's physiology that's out there on the computer screen for two people, a therapist and a client, to be able to monitor. And this was what they would emphasize often in their educational training of therapists, is how to work with a client who their hands are cooling, and you told them that the goal was to warm their hands, and they feel like it's a complete failure.
Mm,
And how to help someone reassess their physiologic data to begin to understand that the goal is letting go of the need to control and giving up the effort to be more narrow focused. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that ultimately the goal is developing a sense of self-agency.
Mhm.
When someone does know how to turn that around, or does get a sense that they can warm their hands and feel that sense of or deep relaxation or reverie that Carol's talking about, that transforms an individual's sense of who they are.
Mhm.
Sense of,
Mhm.
I can have control over my world,
Yeah.
which is a pivot in terms of people's life trajectory.
Yeah, and that may be like however we are able to account for Green's approach there. Also, I think informs the Monroe stuff, because I think his primary concern with Monroe and the subliminal tapes was this idea that you would experience improvement with these tapes, but you wouldn't identify it as you being the agent responsible for that improvement, and you become dependent on these external things. And Monroe continues to develop that with HemiSync. So they're tools that are therapeutic or useful, but they don't have this, or they might be, but they don't have this element of kind of self-empowerment that Green was focusing on. So I think that's reflected in some of the language here. So he even says here, the patient's own mind-body powers are being stimulated by belief and expectancy. So he's saying the tapes are a placebo. The person listening to them is still the person improving. It's not the tapes. Anyway.
No, say, oh, it's not really, you're just making a suggestion. They're not really learning something. But they also would say, well, the term psychosomatic illness, is basically a real illness that was understood to be related more to maybe a way of thinking or perception, something like that. And so both Alyce and Elmer would talk about, well, if you could have psychosomatic illness, what is that? Can we harness that and turn it into psychosomatic health? And it's like, oh, no, well, I hadn't thought of it that way, but the whole approach was really self-awareness first, self-regulation, skill development, and then moving toward self-mastery. You don't need the equipment anymore. So the point was to not need the equipment. And this was part of the, revenue-driven medical insurance, hospital, doctors model that they wanted to help influence, but they really weren't that interested in teaching people to fish, right? They wanted to go buy the fish. Yeah, so there were all those pressures and dynamics that were going on at that time. So I find your work I'm so excited, so happy you guys are looking at this work and helping flesh it out and take it.
And that you seem to understand it.
Yeah.
I'm
Right.
trying. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is, but on the prototype, previous slide, on the 3D prototype, what is the thing with the conch shell? Yeah, what is that?
Peter?
Yeah, I can say what that is. It's probably upside down. It's one of Elmer's, the project that I started working with him in 1984, but he had gotten a grant from the Fetzer Institute to study, it's called the Copper Wall Project, or Physical Fields and States of Consciousness was the formal title. But he was looking at the electric fields around humans. And so he brought in a group of healers that would use their hands for non-contact therapeutic touch. And we were monitoring the body potential of the human, of the healer, and the environment, the 4 panels. There was a copper panel in front, back, above, and below. And you know, found some pretty fascinating stuff happening at certain moments in this, quote, healing, non-contact therapeutic touch experience. And so that model was built after we had published a number of papers, and Elmer was saying, you know, I don't know exactly what his words were, but there, you know, conceptually, what we were monitoring was the output of the chakras that go up the spine, you know, at the base of the spine. But he said there are chakras in your hand, and that he was interested in building a model that we could hook that up to the electrometers, that you could put your hand in the middle of that, and when you sent energy, we could then measure it in it's a little bit more manageable. You know, that little design, that's 12 by, or, you know, 18 by 18 by 18, whereas the copper room was so large, you couldn't really transport it. But
So-
there's a conch shell in the middle of it, I guess, for photographs.
It was just there, yeah. Yeah.
That's not part of the pyramid. Monitoring.
But the copper wall to me is there were efforts around this time in a number of, well, maybe not a number of different ways. I actually, there was another inventor, Andrea Puharich, who attempted to patent a similar type of wall that was basically, there was an interest in identifying whether or not there was an electromagnetic basis for extrasensory or other non-identified, you know, signals. So there are other experiments with creating rooms or environments to monitor or to exclude electromagnetic signal so as to isolate what you're studying. And Andrea Puharich actually tried to patent this charged box that was supposed to exclude. The patent was rejected on, you know, basically that it was not viable invention. And I went to Kansas City, and there's a whole history of it. He appealed, and there's all this documentation on arguing around the nature of the invention. So that doesn't feature here, but it is, I think the Copper Wall project does, like it actually does have like a lineage. It has other practices around it.
There were so many folks that wanted shielded rooms, and in fact at Vinegar, they built a shielded room, you know, a Faraday cage, closed the door, all of the room was completely isolated, you know, at least theoretically. And Elmer was like, well, we don't want that. So that was where we would use to hook people up and then take them into the copper wall room where there were no shields, because he wanted connection to the environment without shielding out other extraneous sources. I mean, I'm sorry, there were shields on each of the panels, so that, you know, the electricity coming from the control room wouldn't cause fields that would influence. But as far as shielding the entire environment, he was saying that's not.
But you could actually see the heart rate on the wall. That was.
Well, that was actually with a prototype that Elmer had put together. He had you know, when he first found an electrometer made by Beckman, he had been first read about this research in 1940 in a book about India, about folks in India, and knew that it was possible to build an electrometer and pull together all the parts and pieces and try to build it himself as a physicist. And he never accomplished it, but in around 1982, he found a Beckman polygraph that he could plug it in to his equipment and then run wires and have a copper panel, and you could see the heart signal on the copper panel. And that was 4 feet away, without fire. So, you know, because the heart is the biggest electrical signal of the body, and when it's, you know, you had to have a sensitive device to be able to pick it up.
Yeah.
I just wondered if access to the research that Pat Norris did with research with biofeedback?
Access to, yes. Some of that material I may have photographed to look at later, but probably not enough to get a good handle on her work.
When they talk about empowerment and
Yeah,
change life.
yeah, 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 yeah. No, I mean, yeah, there's a lot of work, and also in the educational settings as well. Like some of that work I think would be really interesting to take a closer look at. So I might be able to, but as I mentioned, with the framing, I mean, the Greens were originally just going to be, I don't know, they were always going to be a chapter, but there's needless to say more here than will be able to go into the book, given that we're trying to at least cover at least 50 years, 40s to 90s into 2000s. So yeah, but it's definitely worth looking at. Thank you.
Because as you said, there may have been some risk involved with some scientists or professionals participating or being associated with Green.
Yeah.
Are you finding as you go through the correspondence requests for confidentiality or things? And if so, how are you dealing with that in terms of the publication or your research?
Great question. Yeah. So the Greens materials at the house are include a lot of personal material. So Ari and I have agreed to discuss any of those issues with the foundation. I avoided photographing anything involving kind of what I would consider personally identifiable information related to like patients or subjects. So basically the relevant names in the book will almost certainly always be the researchers. I guess I do have some information on the healers that participated in the Copper Wall project, but we may not even mention who those are. And then there's a lot of material that is marked proprietary and confidential, patent-related stuff, some of Julian Gresser's stuff, which trade secrets continue even if the corporation doesn't exist. So like, if it's confidential, it's, technically. So I'd like to talk to Julian, but I think I've found enough on Discovery Engineering International and non-confidential materials to tell part of that story. So basically it's a bit of a negotiation since there's been no lawyers to have looked through the materials. I'll say incidentally, like, yeah, there's a lot of personal info and phone numbers and things like that. Which, yeah. So, yeah, at the moment, I don't think there's been anything where I'm like, oh, I wish we could tell this part of the story, but we can't. So, yeah, so far it hasn't been a big issue. As far as for archival concerns, it would be a challenge to work through all that material. Yeah, because it's all mixed together, right? So.
I wondered if this piece of equipment, which is what we use to begin with for hand and
No.
little alcohol thermometers that we taped even for those.
I
would bring it along. It's not very. And I used to tease people and say, well, you get your flexibility improved because you have to pick your foot up.
To get that.
Use it before we had digital kind of thing. So.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the human stories with the Green is very important. But I think I am, and I think MIT is also really interested in the kind of the history of the instrumentation, right? I want to tell the human story through, in part, the story of the instrumentation and the data collection. I don't think it excludes the human, but like there is like really interesting stuff going on with the Greens and others' ability to find and modify and adapt tools to do the kind of work that they were doing that I think is really cool. Yeah, and as a legal person, I'm also interested in the patents and how the patents tell a particular story, and the way this started even before this stuff. I was really interested in how humans were positioned in patent documents themselves, right? Because patent documents have particular rules for the drawings, for the figures, that have to identify what features are inventive. But in order to identify them as inventive, you have to like position a human figure, usually like a sketched out human, or brainwave states like Monroe, right? You know, these are from the patent. So and there are rules around how you crosshatch and color a patent drawing. So the inventive step for the patent is like written onto the human subject in the patent documentation. So I was always interested in how like the human gets situated in all of these kind of different formal documents. That's the very like MIT-ish, you know, that's like the academic side of this project is like, what story can you tell about humans through these highly technical documents? But I think that part's really interesting too, so.
Material. We try to do some of that on the Boston side now. We also have some books and photos and actually their children, you know, you mentioned Patricia Norris was their daughter. She also worked at Vinegar. Their other daughter, Judy Green, also worked at Vinegar, and their son, Doug Boyd, he was an author, but he also worked in the field. So, you know, it was a whole family, and there is a really good book up there by Judy Green, her husband, Bob Schellenberger, who used to have the only undergrad biofeedback training program in the country. That was out in, I think, Lombard, somewhere on the eastern side of Colorado. But, you know, there were so many things that happened though where it just never took hold, mostly because insurance wouldn't pay for people to do biofeedback training. Just mind-boggling to me because it was so based in stuff. You could do hypnosis, NDR, you know, all these other things, and they would pay for that. They would not pay if you sat down with your psychotherapy client and you used the biofeedback tools. That was, you know, they made a special code, and then that was eliminated to be paid for. And so it really tanked the whole clinical field.
Well, yeah. So if you're interested, yeah, I think I need to add my name to that. So, all right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.